Hi, I'm Miguel Garcia, creator and host of the Sports as a Weapon podcast, a Chicano sports podcast on the entanglement of sports, radical politics, and working class sports fan culture. We talk just sports too. Subscribe and listen to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. You can also listen to the podcast on Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and Pandora. Follow the podcast on Twitter at Sports as a Weapon and on Instagram and Facebook at Sports as a Weapon Podcast. Or visit our website at www.sportsasaweapon.com.
Hey, this is Dave Zirin, and you are listening to the Sports as a Weapon Podcast.
We came here to build the new Chicano movement. That's what we came here for. We came here to build the new Chicano movement. That's what we came here for. Bryant.
Hey everyone, it's Miguel Garcia and welcome to another episode of the Sports as a Weapon podcast, a Chicano sports podcast on the entanglement of sports, radical politics, and working class sports fan culture. And don't worry, we talk about just sports too. Just a reminder, Sports as a Weapon is now part of the Anti-Conquista media collective network. Anti-Conquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. We are dedicated to exposing and fighting the capitalist imperialist system, the root cause of our displacement. Subscribe to the Anti-Conquista Patreon at patreon.com/Anticonquista and follow Anti-Conquista on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Also, be sure to listen to our podcast and subscribe to our podcast, Sports as a Weapon Podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. And today's guest, I'm very excited to welcome to the show. He created one of my favorite podcasts. Started listening to it maybe about a year ago. Welcome Sam from Southpaw Podcast Network. Welcome, Sam. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it. I'm a fan of the show and, it's an honor.
Thank you. Thank you. So been thinking about having you on my podcast. Again, if you guys don't know about Southpaw, you guys got to check it out. It's one of my favorite podcasts. Sam took kind of the similar, sort of ideas that I've tried to do with my podcast, talk about, it's political, talk about Marxism, anti-imperialism. And then from my point of view, I try to highlight some Chicano sports stuff, with my little segments I'll do about Chicano history. And then whenever I get an episode that might be related to like my diaspora, but that's what I also like about your podcast, Sam, that you talk about Korean history and the issues, of what's happened with US imperialism and before that Japanese imperialism with the Korean peninsula. But yeah, it's something I really enjoy about Southpaw when you get into that history. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, appreciate it. I'm a fan. Also a fan of the Anti-Conquista network too. So yeah, I don't know when you all joined up, but I was excited to see that.
It's like September, I think, when I joined up with them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was long ago.
That was good to see.
But that was the same thing. I was a fan of them. I'd watch their streams, listen to them. I got in contact with Victor, hit me up, wanted me to join up. That's when I kind of joined.
Okay.
So yeah, that's pretty awesome. So kind of noticed you're a fan of them too. So it's pretty cool. We're finally connecting here on my podcast.
Everybody has to represent the sports side too, right? That was like a part that people were kind of forgetting about or not thinking about representing, but then sports is such a big deal for a lot of people.
Yeah. And that's why when Victor approached me and then, talked to the rest of the comrades in the collective, that was kind of Victor's thing too. Like, hey, I know, I like your podcast. You talk about sports and like Marxism and politics and anti-imperialism, and then about Chicano stuff. So that was kind of like, we need that in our collective. So that was kind of how I joined up too. But that's why I kind of like about your podcast, because I like MMA and combat sports, but I say I'm like a casual fan. I'm not like, know a lot about it. I just kind of watch big fights, but I've started to get into it more. But that was also why I enjoy Southpaw, because you're kind of doing that, talking about MMA and combat sports when it comes to this stuff. So that really, helps me also. When I know you guys started it's not that new, but you have different podcasts now on your network, but you guys do like fight study and stuff.
Yeah.
So things like that, when I've kind of learned more things about MMA, because like I said, I'm a casual. I've had one episode on MMA, which was pretty cool. We got into like the unionization fight they've had in the past, stuff like that.
Okay. Who did you have on
I've
for
done
that?
Dr. McLaren.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Visibility. Jennifer McLaren, yes.
Yeah.
Her book is pretty awesome. So we talked about that. I had her on my podcast. So now I'm here talking to you, and you bring like similar, things that she talks about, but you focus a lot on Marxism, and combat sports. And then I think it's pretty cool how your network has kind of grown. And I'm not a Star Trek person, but I think that's pretty cool. You have that on your network, Yeah. I've thought about stuff like that on my podcast, do something different like that. But I like how there's something for everyone with your podcast, even though there's that focus on Marxism.
Yeah.
So yeah, I talked a lot right there, more than I thought I would in the intro. But you want to say anything else? Plug in the podcast. Talked about it a lot, but and then we can just go straight to the questions.
Yeah, if we want to bookend it, if you want to find me, you can find me at LiberationistMA on Twitter. You can find more about my network on southpawpod.com. And I'm sure we're going to plug this again at the end too.
Yep. All right, let's get into it. So, we talked about a little bit, me being a fan of your podcast, but, can you give a background to our audience that may have never heard of Southpaw Podcast? What made you want to start the podcast?
Yeah. So for most of my life, I've been training some form of martial art or combat sports. And for a very long time, even as an adult, I've been doing 2-a-days. So, you do a sports podcast, so you know what that means, right? It's just training twice a day. It's a lot of training. I'm also an avid podcast listener. So during an injury where I had more free time, and having known for years how reactionary martial arts in the US was, I thought someone ought to make a podcast as an alternative for people with more liberatory politics, or at least the ones who wanted to actively avoid chuds and toxic spaces. Especially when I started, since podcasts at the time were really getting popular. And I've been analyzing the nature of reactionary politics and white supremacy, masculinity, culture, and combat sports for a long time, but didn't really have a way to share that knowledge with others. So it was a combination of a lot of things that came together. And, podcasts came along. And I think COVID really hit podcasts hard, where up until that, more and more people were listening. And then after that, because people were like working from home more, or they were unemployed and they weren't commuting as much, I think everybody I know, their podcast numbers just like dropped after the pandemic.
I started my podcast in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic that first year.
Okay.
Yeah, like I always wanted to start a podcast. I actually had a website just called sportsasaweapon.com. When I was in grad school, I wrote some stuff on there, but I didn't keep up with it. But I always kept the website because I liked my name. I'm like, people always telling me to start a podcast because of my voice. So I finally did it in the middle of the pandemic. So that was like, I think August 2020. So when it was first starting kind of that summer when everyone was. So it was kind of, I know it was like a few other people did that too.
Yeah. A lot of people during that time created projects online.
But then what kind of sucked about, well, obviously the pandemic sucks, but like I still work from home for my job still at this moment. But what I did enjoy about commuting to my job was I would listen to all my podcasts in the morning. Like I would still listen to it at work whenever I had headphones on and I could have them on. But that was something I really liked doing when I'm driving. Is listen to podcasts. Like before it used to be music, which I still do sometimes. It was kind of interesting how the more I got, cause I, like you, I listened to a lot of podcasts. When I just got really into podcasts, like avid listener, like that's something I really like doing when I'm driving to work and driving back home. So I kind of miss that sometimes because now I'm still working at home at the moment. One of the lucky, I guess, people that's still working from home.
Did you find that you started walking more and then just started listening during your walks? A lot of people do that.
Yeah. And I still listen to it while I'm at home too. But yeah, like you find other ways to listen because that was kind of my routine that I got used to was driving to work and listening to them. And that, you know, it'd be depending on the podcast, just whatever one's on my feed that I'm like, oh, I want to listen to this one today, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Cause most of the ones I listen to are sports or political related, you know?
Okay.
I'll listen to other things too, other type of podcast genres, but I guess those are the main ones, obviously. Sports and political podcasts.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think I heard about your podcast through a couple comrades who told me about it. And then that's when I looked you up, started listening to it.
Yeah. I don't even think you need to be an MMA fan to listen to the network because there's so many other stuff, so many other offerings on there that, you know, I think there's only one show, the Fight Study show, where you have to watch MMA. But other than that, you really don't need to care anything about MMA.
Yeah, because one of my favorite episodes, you guys all did that series on Taekwondo.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's 3 parts. So that was pretty cool. And then, like I mentioned in the intro, you all have a Star Trek podcast now. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to explain that one. That one's pretty cool, though, for people that like that, you know?
Yeah, it's not even meant for people who watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but it's episode by episode. And we're kind of doing it very much like sports commentary in that one person does the play-by-play, explaining every beat of the show, every little thing that happens. And then I'm more of the color commentator. And we both kind of just give our analysis of whatever happened in that scene. So even if you don't watch the episode, you can just listen and you'll know everything that happened in that episode, kind of like reading or listening to a wiki summary, except on top of that, you're getting commentary. So it's very much borrowing from like the sports commentary genre, which I don't think anybody else was doing that. So, you know, a lot of things we do, even if it's not about combat sports, it's still drawing from or informed by that approach.
Yeah, it's really cool. Cause like I said, I'm a casual, like I like it, but I'm not, you know, when you guys do those Fight Study episodes, you guys know your stuff. But you know, like you said, you don't have to be like someone that's like an avid MMA fan. Mm-hmm. You could just be a casual or even someone that doesn't even like MMA, but because your podcast talks about other things, you know, using MMA, as we're talking about here, Marxism, you even got a Star Trek themed podcast, talk about anti-imperialism, just all these different things. So that's what I really enjoy about it, like I said. And one of my questions I have that I want to ask you is, so what is a Marxist analysis of MMA and combat sports?
Okay. So I think a Marxist analysis is just as much about what it is, or is just as much about what it isn't as it is about what it is. So it isn't a space for racism, casual or otherwise. I'm sure you're aware of this with sports commentary. There's a lot of like what sounds normal. If you actually break it down, it's very like casually racist, especially how they talk about the bodies, right? So it's not going to be like that. It's not going to punch down. It's not going to be ableist or macho or anti-LGBTQ. And this is my own personal taste, but it's also not going to be edgy or cringe, because being edgy just means to me, trying to be on the edge of something offensive. And I just don't want to do that. I just don't want to walk that line, because if you're on that line anyway, then you're already being offensive. So that's just my own personal taste. I know there's a lot of popular lefty podcasts out there who are very edgy. Typically, they're not for me. I don't like listening to that either. But you know, if you like listening to that or you find that funny, I'm not saying you shouldn't listen to it. It's just my own personal aesthetic. So if you listen to the Southpaw Network, that's a general aesthetic for all of our shows. And even if we don't talk about anything explicitly political, that's one thing you'll get. That's part of my Marxist analysis, is you won't be cringing at anything either. So even in the absence, right, it's about what we chose to remove. That is still, for me, very Marxist. So if nothing else, for me, it has to be like that. As far as an explicitly Marxist lens, I look at everything from a systems perspective. So political economy and world systems, but also from the Eastern martial arts perspective of how you do one thing is how you do all things. So the financial structure for example, of the UFC dictates not only how anti-worker it is, but also how the fighters actually fight. It bleeds both ways. How you do one thing is how you do all things. This is an application I use for how I look at imperialism. How you do things domestically is how the U.S. does things internationally.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were talking about fighters, then we're seeing fighters as combat sports workers. If we're talking about some of the other offerings like pro wrestling, then it's seeing them as sports entertainment workers and analyzing from the perspective of labor. And all the while we're trying to share our joy for the science of the sport, whatever the sport we're talking about. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about here too. And another aspect of this that people kind of get surprised at, but it shouldn't be surprising if you really think about it, is like, I talk a lot about finance, not just for fighters and stuff like that, but just in how I analyze everything. And so why would a podcast network that started out mostly talking about mixed martial arts and combat sports spend so much time talking explicitly about finance and global finance, right? And dollar hegemony and stuff like that. Because I even did a multi-part series just analyzing finance that didn't talk about MMA at all. And the reason why is because, going back to how you do one thing is how you do all things, financial domination is physical domination. The way physical domination works is the same way financial domination works. And I think this is an area that a lot of socialist leftists are weak on. And because of that blind spot, they end up often having unconsciously reactionary takes or liberal takes or, pro-imperialist takes, because they don't fully grasp what they're saying. They don't fully understand how the sausage is made. So oftentimes, if they don't even understand how financial capital works, the solutions they're offering or the criticisms they're making might be directly reinforcing those same belief systems or those same institutions, but they don't know, because they don't know how it works anyway. So if they don't know how it works anyway, then they don't know what they're replicating.
I think that was some really good series you did there, because if we're going to talk about Marxism and, anti-capitalism, capitalism, anti-imperialism, imperialism, like, understanding financial systems is very important. And I'm not even going to say that I understand everything completely, but I think that's very important. And then you all doing this series on that is important, because if there's people listening that may not fully understand everything, that's what you were doing that episode for. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I break a lot of it down on social media too. So there's a lot of people who follow us who don't even listen to the podcast. I would say there's more people who follow us that don't listen to the podcast, and they just follow whatever we're saying on social media, which is fine too, because I'm not invested in audio being like the only way to disseminate information. I just want information to get out there. So, often the easiest ways is through social media as well. So I try to think and put a lot of effort and time into what I post online. Even if it's a lot of stuff, I do put a lot of thought into it.
And that's something I've noticed as well. You're a really good tweeter when it comes to tweeting information. The recent tweet you actually tweeted was about Mexico and like JP Morgan, I believe. And something I didn't know about, and it's like something I want to know about as someone who's a Mexican descent. So it's, you pointed something out I didn't know. And so I appreciate tweets like that, so keep doing that, because you're really good at it.
Yeah. I saw somebody today kind of replying and rebutting to something somebody said about that dropping nuclear bombs on Japan was justified. And it was like this liberal journalist that had tweeted that. And somebody took one of my old tweets where I explained a lot of what happened in Japan and how they were censored by the US from even speaking about the horrors of the nuclear bomb. And they remember that. It stuck in their mind. It recalibrated their views about Japan. And so then they use my tweet to counteract what that other person was saying or deconstruct all the problems of what that person was saying. And it's like, that's exactly what I want my posts to do, is to make people recalibrate, and then for them to be able to use that to deconstruct some of the gaslighting that they're constantly being fed.
And I've done that before when I've tweeted or shared posts on Instagram. Like, I've taken screenshots of your tweets before. Whenever you make some really good points, I share it. But stuff like that, that I really appreciate. Sometimes I don't know, like, I'll do tweets, but I don't tweet like that as much as I would like to. So whenever there's people that do that, and I really appreciate it, because that also takes time from your day, when you're tweeting. People like, it's just social media, but it takes time to tweet about stuff like this, informing people. And that's why I really enjoy also following you, because I've learned a lot about like Korean history through your tweets. Mm-hmm. And then when you recommend books and stuff like that. So that's something else I appreciate too. I've tried to do that too sometimes when I've done tweets, just stuff related to Chicano history, and politics. That's at least with my podcast, I'll do my Chicano history segment and stuff. And that's kind of my idea for that. You know, I want to point out some history to people, you know, that might be Chicano like me, that might be listening to stuff that I never knew about. The ones I do are sports related, but that's another reason why I also joined Anti-Conquista, because we'll do the whole Latin America angle when it comes to anti-imperialism and issues facing Latin America. But so I also appreciate you tweeting about your own culture, Korean culture, the history of it. When I've read stuff about you, like you've talked about it on your podcast and even in tweets, like you've learned a lot of history, Korean history through your father and like elders. Mm-hmm. I think that's like something cool that you point out, because those are the people that experience those things. You know, it's important to if you got to actually learn about that from them. Yeah, you know, I guess talk about it and bring that information. You know,
I have a very, I would say, unique view, especially in the West. It might not be as unique in Korea, let's say, but it's pretty unique in Korea too. But it's even more unique in the West and especially the US, because I'm like a young Gen X or late millennial, right? But my dad, he's passed away, but he was born in the 20s. So he lived through Japanese occupation, and then he saw all the popular uprising and independence movements. He was also very well read, and he spoke several languages, part of which is because he was forced to learn Japanese. But so I was in that situation where I had him, and he was able to observe it. But also we come from a family that's indigenous Korean. So there's an island in Korea called Jeju Island, which is where we're from. So it also gives us another unique perspective. And so from all those kind of things, like culminating, kind of like how I accidentally started this podcast network, it gave me kind of a front row like seat to listening to my dad and other elders before they died. Right. So this is another reason why it's unique, is because other people won't ever be able to talk to people like my father anymore, because they're gone. They're dead. Right. So, and also my age is important, because even if they did, people who are older than me, they grew up during a very reactionary time. So even if they knew about that stuff, they themselves are very reactionary. So then they kind of don't want to talk about it, or they will put their own spin on it. Right. So I think all of these reasons why I've become kind of a record keeper for that. But then it's kind of the same situation I'm in with martial arts, especially Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, mixed martial arts, where it's very reactionary. Like the culture is very, very reactionary, right? So I was one of the few leftists who started very early. So a lot of people started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, mixed martial arts, let's say in the last 5 years or so, right? But I was there when like it was first coming to this country. This country as in the US.
Popular.
Yeah. So I was like watching UFC from UFC 1. And as soon as I saw it, I wanted to go train it. So we had to learn through tapes and all this stuff. So I was there basically from the beginning of watching MMA culture and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu culture blossom, but had that anti-imperial lens. And so I have kind of like a, historical knowledge about this, institutional knowledge about this other people didn't have that were left-leaning. There's no left-leaning people who was paying attention from the beginning. So that's another thing I think why I have unique takes that people constantly refer back to me for, because there was nobody else witnessing this stuff with my politics who was there from the very beginning, at least in the US. And then who was around to hear the stories from the people who had just gone to Brazil? There was a time where people just thought everybody loved the Gracies or whatever. But in the early on, it was like known that it's very odd. The Americans who trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the beginning in the 90s knew the Gracies were fascists, but then some kind of myth making happened, which I kind of was there for. So I saw it happen. It was just more unbelievable that it worked, but then you forgot about that. And all of a sudden they were honored and revered. Right. So, but I was there for that myth making. I was there live to see that happen. And so I've kind of reported on that. And there's a lot of things written about that now in the last several years, but either I helped do the background for that, or, I could see some of those authors, even if they didn't credit me, I saw them engaging in my long tweets where I posted all these facts or evidence or citations. And then they were engaging with it. And then I could see how a lot of the things I said, I see in their articles. So I'm like, okay, so I was still part of that in some way.
Yeah, even though they pretty much kind of ripped you off, but spreading the info, right?
Yeah, that's what's more important. But also like having written articles before, there's so much work that goes into it. So there's like nothing to really credit for because they have to do so much work on their own.
Yeah, they still do their own research and then they kind of used your information probably to supplement it. But yeah, that was going to be one of my questions about right-wing ideology and MMA. But that was something you talk about in your show is the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and then obviously other martial arts. And I'm sorry I interrupted. What were we going to say?
I was going to say, just like you brought up the thing with JP Morgan in Mexico and Zapatistas. Like, I want authors to use it like that. I want writers to see my tweets. Everything you need to write an article won't be there. I just want that to like germinate something in somebody and then they go do something. I mean, it's just a tweet. How much information can I put on, right? So I just want to get that. Yeah, just a screenshot
of a couple paragraphs and then you tweeted about it. But that caught my eye and now I'm like trying to look into that, look more into it. But that's what's awesome, even just about tweets like that. Might just be, a few characters, but people like me at least will read it and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. And I'll like research it.
Yeah.
That's what's really cool, about you doing that. And then especially like when it comes, like I said, with your own culture, with Korean culture, understanding those things, because that's kind of my goal. At first, when I started this podcast, I wasn't even thinking about like my Chicano culture, even though I was Chicano. I was kind of just thinking, just politics and sports. But then I was like, well, I don't think I didn't see many podcasts kind of talk about, like, and not everything I talk about in my podcast episodes are to do with Chicano, like history and politics. But I didn't really see anyone kind of, I guess, putting that focus in there. Like, it's, it's not what I'm going to talk about every time, but I guess from that perspective, I didn't see too much because when I started my podcast, some of my influences were just like people like Dave Zirin and others like that. But I wanted to, I guess, put my more Chicano, commie perspective more to it, even though I'm not going to talk about that all the time. But that's why I also like Southpaw because you'll do things like that. Like when I was listening to your Taekwondo history episodes, like hear what you're talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and its connection to fascism and right-wing ideology. And how you were there when it started. Also, like when you're talking about the myth making, you talked about that in the Taekwondo episodes with your guest. I think his name was Jay. He was your guest, right, for those episodes?
Yeah.
And so to me, those episodes are just really awesome because I got to learn more about the connection of Taekwondo to, I guess, these myth making and like right-wing ideology.
Yeah. I think a lot of people who listen to it never even trained Taekwondo or ever even trained martial arts. I think they were just curious what these seemingly disparate ideas had to do with each other. And then in that curiosity, they were like, oh, this is kind of like a template. These are just kind of metaphors for how, the system works, how these tactics work, how it's implemented.
What was one of these connections from Taekwondo to US imperialism and also Japanese imperialism? There's this connection, right? And in your episodes, you talked about how the first prime minister or president that was installed by the US imperialists, once they took over from Japan, they put in their own puppet like they always do. But that was the Syngman Rhee. And you talk about his history, like he grew up in the US. Like, I don't know about grew up, but he was there for years, went to Yale, I believe, and other top Ivy League schools. But I knew about that, but then you talk about his connection to Taekwondo. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, he saw in that art something that he could build to help build this ethno-nationalist like myth making. And especially for Rhee, he wanted to also build like a right-wing Christian state. So there's a movement back then about like, muscular Christianity. And there was a lot of like this fascist physical body movement happening at the same time. So he was very much aware of that, influenced by that. So Taekwondo became important for that right-wing masculine ideology. And for him, his worldview was very much associated with masculinity. And then the reason why he didn't like communism, one of the reasons is anything that was tender-hearted, let's say, egalitarian, was associated with feminism. So him and other dictators of Korea really took Taekwondo and tried to make it this symbol, which we see now come to roost with the new president-elect, Yoon, who is like ran on being the anti-feminist president. So even when it's talking about feminism. What they mean by feminism is socialism. It's all intertwined together. Just like in the US, socialism, feminism, and anything related to talking about the injustices of race and of racism is all the same thing, right? So it works very similarly in Korea.
Yeah, and when you talked about, Christian masculinity, the same thing kind of happened in Mexico, like in the 1900s, early 1900s, because of the YMCA. The YMCA is pretty much a tool. They would go all these countries, and I'm assuming that probably also happened in Korea.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, right. Because they're the Young Christian Men's Association, right?
Yeah, and there were these fascist Nazi body exercise, like calisthenic gymnast dudes from Europe who very much influenced the YMCA to spread that type of Christian muscular masculinity gospel, along with like eugenics and colonialism.
Mm-hmm. It was all around that same period, and they did that in Mexico, and they like made their first YMCA like in Mexico City, but it was, using that same ideology. Another thing I want to talk about, we talked about a lot of things already, but I really want to talk about your article that you wrote about analyzing Squid Game from Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
Your article was in the Real News Network.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Squid Game and the Long Shadow of the American Empire. Could you talk about that article? That article is really awesome. Like, I have it right here. Printed it out for, when we're talking about it. But you pretty much broke down like all the games and like their connections to US imperialism, and even, before that a little bit with Japan. So if you could talk about that. I heard your episode with the East is a Podcast talking about that. That was a really good episode, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I got this. I've been wanting to have you on my podcast. I was like, I'm going to ask him about that too. I'm just going to copy the East is a Podcast on that question. But the article is really important. So
yeah, I highly encourage everybody to Google that article title and find it and read it, because a lot of what happened in Korea is replicated in what the US has done in a lot of other countries. Like they did in Korea was practiced for Latin America, Indonesia, Vietnam, so they did it over and over. And there's actually like uncovered documents where they say that. They say Korea was practiced for a lot of their other overthrows and interventions. As far as the article, I wanted a way to get people who may have no interest in learning about colonialism in Korea to read about colonialism in Korea. So I used the popular Netflix show as a vehicle to get people to learn about it by connecting events in the show with events in recent Korean history. So Westerners are aware of atrocities by Japan and Korea and hit over the head about how awful the DPRK is, but they almost never hear about US crimes in Korea. And so, like a martial artist, I wanted to exploit that weakness. And I think you can read the article as standalone without ever watching the show for that reason. And I think a lot of people who read the article never did watch the show. So it does stand on its own like that. But I think if you watch the show, it will be more visceral, because I am going to connect your memories of the show with moments in Korean history with the US as the invisible VIPs.
Yeah, I watched the show. I kind of had that analysis too, but, didn't have the as much knowledge when it comes to Korean history. Mm-hmm. But like you said, I don't think anyone actually needs to watch the show to read this article and kind of understand the connections. And like you said, you wanted to use that as a weapon, to pretty much educate people what happened in Korea and how US imperialism has pretty much had control of the peninsula. But that's kind of how my name came up for my my podcast is Sports as a Weapon. You do that with your Southpaw Network podcast. It's using sports or something as a weapon to talk about these issues.
I lure them with a popular show that was the most popular Netflix show of all time. You take the popularity of the show, you take people's interest in Korean history, and they're opposite. People's interest, Westerners' interest in Korean history is like very low. Their interest in that show is very high. I wanted to use that show to lure people in, to make them learn about something they normally wouldn't want to learn about, right? And it's kind of like how my tweets work is I use it as kind of like a seed where maybe they wouldn't normally be interested in something. And then I plant a seed in their idea, and then, maybe they want to look more into something. The same thing I do with, using martial arts or sports or Star Trek. Use that, get them to come in for those things, but they stay for the anti-imperial history and the Marxist analysis.
I know you talked about all the different games from the episodes. Besides the main game, Squid Game, which two games do you think are really probably maybe the best example of what you're trying to convey to people when reading the article?
They'd have to have watched the show, right? I think for them to know which games there are. But I think for the people who like watch the show, I think plot wise for them, what stands out is like the marbles game. But I think some of the most historically relevant ones was just like that first game of Dakji, which wasn't even one of the official games. It was like the game you played to even get into the Squid Game. But it's basically saying red or blue. It's an illusion of choice, right? Whatever you do, you're fucked. And that's kind of what imperialism occupation is like, is Korea can vote for a president. They could vote for peace with North Korea, but it doesn't matter because unless the U.S. signs off on it, it's meaningless, right? So it's giving people choices, and it's about, I think a lot of people make this mistake, mistaking choices for freedom. Just because you have choices doesn't mean you're actually able to materially change your conditions. I think this is, again, why Marxism is important, because you can't just think about changing ideas. It's easy to change an idea. It's just a thing in your head that you have complete control over, versus material conditions, which is not things that you have complete control over. You have some say in it, but then there's some conditions that you have no say in. Only say you have is maybe how you're going to emotionally react to it, but that's even hard to do. Right. But as far as like, can you affect your exterior world? That's what that game is about, is you have these choices that you're given in lieu of actually being able to change your material conditions. I think the other game I think about is the first game where, the American version of the game would be red light, green light, where players are coming and stopping. But there's this doll there that's killing everybody. And that doll was an invention of the Syngman Rhee regime, basically to tell people, act like these dolls, model the behaviors of these characters. So there was two of them. There was the female character and a male counterpart, which wasn't in the game. But the game version is really like talking about what it was like, because under the Rhee fascist regime, if you didn't act the way he wanted you to act, he would kill you, which is what happened in the game. So it's like people look at that game and think it's too unrealistic. And it's like, in fact, the real version of that, where the Rhee regime told you how to act using these types of characters to tell you how he wants you to act in the new Korean society that he has envisioned. And if you don't act properly, he will kill you. And that's just like, the hundreds of people that are in that game. He's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. And he did kill hundreds of thousands of people.
And it's interesting because, when they even go to this game, they're like pretty much in like a camp, which is concentration camps, which you talk about also, the metaphor of the actual concentration camps that Koreans were put in South Korea after the U.S. takeover. And the way propaganda has worked here in the U.S. and in the West, when they think of concentration camps in Korea, they probably think about, North Korea, because they're so, the propaganda is so insane that they believe all these things, right? But you point that out too, how this was just another metaphor of the concentration camps they actually had in South Korea. That was, pretty much they put leftists in there, pretty much. Yeah. Anyone that opposed the right-wing regime.
And not even like leftists. It's people who are suspected of leftism. Or sometimes it's because anybody can join these death squads and these goon squads. Sometimes it's not even a leftist. It might be just somebody you don't like. And then you just use that to eliminate them or take their property or whatever it is, right? So this is what really bothers me about a lot of like Western leftists who have here's the thing, right? Just like Marxism, just like critical race theory, just like feminism, these are all like lenses. These are all schools of thought. So just because you're now a leftist, I guess you can say I'm a leftist, so now I'm also like a this, a that. I'm also a feminist. I'm also like an anti-racist. I'm also blah, 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 whatever you want to add on to that, right? But that's not giving actual respect to each one of these things as a nuanced school of thought and with their own literature and their own theory. So a lot of people say, once they adopt leftism, they're like, I'm anti-imperialist, not realizing that's his own school of thought that comes with his own like education and theory and history books by a lot of, more than theory, it's a lot of history books by anti-imperialist, historians. A lot of these anti-imperialist historians aren't even necessarily Marxists or communists. They might fancy themselves apolitical. What was important was they were just trying to get the facts straight, right? And it's about reading those authors. And so, how I'm connecting this back to Korea is like we look at these concentration camps and it was all anti-communist, right? But the people who were sent to them, killed in them, weren't all communists, right? And so then you got to think about these Westerners who are leftists who still promote anti-communism and thinking only the other camp is going to get locked up. And it's like, no, man. Like anarchists are going to get locked up, progressives, people who are just like apolitical and just have questions, or people just bad timing or just like pissed off the wrong person, right? So
could even be religious, right? Because maybe they're Catholic.
Yeah. There was a lot of
how Protestantism really took over when it comes to the right wing ideology once US kind of, took control of Korea.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there's some of that I don't know if you've faced it, but I know it exists where Latinos, they have their own history of Catholicism and it's not all good. But then when they come here, then they meet very religious, preachy, Latino Protestants who got converted more recently or whatever. Now they want to Americanize you, right? It's like, shit, I got already one form of colonialism. And now they're saying that colonialism, they're looking down on that form of colonialism as being too brown, right? Protestantism is more white, more elevated.
Which I think you might have talked about this in the article or maybe just some tweets I might have read. But like some Koreans would look down at the Koreans who might be Catholic, and you talk about that whole dynamic. Oh, well, the Catholics have Latinos, brown people, etc.
Yes.
And how that right wing white supremacy ideology, pretty much influenced them, and now they're projecting it on other Koreans because they're not fitting that Americanized version that they want.
Yeah. So there's all these people who are going to get caught up in anti-communism. We're not even communists, right? So then what does it say about you that when you're promoting that type of idea where a version of you in Korea can get killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is there's a certain privilege where you can promote these ideas and know you're safe in the US or whatever from ever being detained or captured or tortured or killed in any of these anti-communist programs. So then it really makes me wonder about whether conscious or unconscious white supremacy, where they know maybe they're, an anarchist. And the anti-communism they're promoting will never kill the white anarchists in the US. It might kill anarchists in, Korea or other countries, but because they're not white anarchists in the West, they don't give a fuck. So they're just like, yeah, I'm going to say all this stuff because they don't care about the consequences, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't really have a lot of good faith for that when people spew that kind of stuff, right? It's like either you know better and you're saying it anyway, or you should know better and you're willfully not wanting to know, right? So you could say plausible deniability, or you know about the anti-communist programs. It doesn't just catch communists, but you don't care because none of them look like you.
Mm-hmm. And that's something I know you tweeted about, and other folks, even let's say with not even just Korea, but with China and all the very anti-Asian, anti-China takes that a lot of these supposed leftists or liberals do when it comes to that. That was, a lot of that was happening with the Olympics. I did episodes that were anti-Olympics when it comes to like issues of displacement and all these things with capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when it came to the China Olympics, I didn't really take use those critiques. And it was because the way I thought about it, I was like, well, why am I going to do that? Even though I know there's these issues with the Olympics in general, when people were pretty much using that to just attack China. They're pretty much hiding their xenophobia through the anti-Olympics talking points.
Yeah,
right?
They weren't anti-Olympics. They were just specifically anti-Chinese Olympics, but pro-Olympics in general.
Which bugged the crap out of me.
Because it's all coming from like, there's this great pure thing, the Olympics, and look at how China is besmirching this beautiful thing, right? If you look at the history and a lot of the people in charge of it, there were so many Nazis involved, the whole running with the torch, the flame, that started with the Nazi Olympics, so the whole history of the Olympics is bad, is very racist, is very white supremacist. And so it's not just about shitting on China, it's using China to elevate whiteness. It's like how a lot of like white supremacists love Japan, but it really has nothing to do with Japan. All the things that they're highlighting about Japan, they're saying is similar to us. So they're really just bragging about themselves.
You're the Asians we like because you're displaying more of Americanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're basically us of Asia. That's why I like you, right? So it's really about bragging about yourself. So similarly, in shitting on China, what they're really trying to do is saying when we do it, our white version of the Olympics is so much better.
Speaking of that, I didn't have this, or not that exactly, but lately you've been tweeting about Orientalism and like Bruce Lee, and like, you know, a lot of people really in the West, a lot of white people are really obsessed with Bruce Lee, and he kind of pointed out how some of those things could be really they're just being racist. They kind of have this Orientalist view, I guess, of Bruce Lee.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the magical Asian trope, right? He's the magical Asian man who could like jump over buildings and like levitate. And it's taking what they believe to be a positive stereotype and mistaking that for actually appreciating the person, which isn't that hard to understand, because if you look at sports, there's a lot of racists in US sports as far as fans and commentators, and a lot of them love black athletes, right? So this isn't a contradiction, but if you listen to how they like the black athletes, it's often, essentializing them and talking about their genetics, their explosiveness, their genetics, their beastly strength, all these things, right? So it's a lot of these types of tropes that they're using on black people, right? And so and maybe a lot of their favorite athletes are black people. That's not the same as appreciating them as a human being. It's appreciating them through this dehumanizing not as in like you don't think there's some of those things that you like. Dehumanizing meaning you're turning them into a non-human, and then you're taking those alien aspects that you like, right? And I think Bruce Lee's the same way. I mean, you look at UFC fans, the majority of UFC fans are racist. Those same racists love Bruce Lee. Dana White loves Bruce Lee. These same people who say they love Bruce Lee will chant USA, USA whenever a Chinese fighter fights, right? Right. Even though that Chinese fighter like does Jeet Kune Do or Wing Chun, whatever martial art that Bruce Lee did, right? Or they're booing and calling Olympic fans, booing and calling traitor to Eileen Gu because she's born here, just like Bruce Lee was born here. Yeah, Bruce Lee went east to escape racism, just like Eileen Gu did, right? And Bruce Lee actually was disliked in his time. Otherwise, why the hell would he have to go to Asia to get an opportunity, right? Because people didn't like him here. He wasn't appreciated here. So the people who say they like Bruce Lee, even though they know their story, are booing Eileen Gu.
Yeah, then they're calling her a traitor. They're calling her a traitor.
Yeah. So how are you appreciating Bruce Lee then? And then only because you're dehumanizing him, you're orientalizing him. He's like the good kind of Chinese person he's like a Rorschach test. You are turning Bruce Lee into whatever you want him to be. And then sometimes using him as an example to shit on other Asians, which people do. I'm sure 90% of the people who have attacked, Asians in the US in the last several years, if you ask them if they're a Bruce Lee fan, I'll bet you, most of them will say yes.
Most of them? You said 90%?
Yeah, 90%. Maybe, because unless you're really young and you have no idea who he is, like most people, it's just a safe answer. If you had to guess at somebody like Bruce Lee, he's such a prolific big figure. Most people, even if they're not into martial arts, or
he's there's someone they'll know who he is.
Yeah, it's like a centrist answer. It's just safe to say you like Bruce Lee.
Sort of like Michael Jordan in a way, like, because a lot of people know who Michael Jordan is. But I like how you did that, brought that comparison with Eileen Gu. Because like you said, Bruce Lee was born in the U.S., right? And then he went to, to Hong Kong and China.
He's also part white, just like Eileen Gu.
Yeah, just like Eileen.
So all these motherfuckers don't even know what the fuck they're talking about, man.
But which is exactly how these chuds always are, which is funny and fucking annoying. But like, it's kind of like that same thing when it's that whole thing like, well, I have a black friend, I'm not racist, or my wife's black, like, but they're still fucking racist and all this other shit they do. Yeah. Like, it's a similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you're right. Well, a lot of white people like Bruce Lee, and probably most of these MMA fans. And I think that may be why, even though I like MMA, I didn't get into it so much.
Yeah.
Because I kind of noticed that, it's that very racist white supremacy that's ingrained in it.
Think about stoners, especially like old stoners. And you might be too young to remember this, but there was like a time where, Cheech and Chong had these movies and they were super popular and they had these comedy albums, right?
Mm-hmm.
And cool. I have nothing bad to say about it, but some of these old stoners, hippies, whoever, if you're old enough, you remember the way they talked about, if you were Latino, they're like, oh, I love Cheech and Chong, right? And then the way they'll talk about it, they'll talk about appreciating them or liking them in a way that's like very racist, like turning them into these like Latino buffoons, right? And so you're like, oh, you're not really respecting them or honoring them or seeing them as human beings. You're seeing them as these cartoons. You're seeing them as like a stoned Speedy Gonzalez or something like that, right? So just because you could appreciate them or like them, let's say, not even appreciate, but like them doesn't mean you can't be racist against Latinos, right? So there's all these types of examples where you can quote unquote like something, but then still be racist to that same group. And also they could be selectively racist where they give a lot of flat out racists might give the pass just specifically to, Michael Jordan. They might openly say they hate all black people, but like Michael Jordan's an exception, right? Or Kobe
they'll
Bryant's
use his example to like hate on LeBron or Kobe or someone that's, not to that more white ideal that they put Jordan at.
Because they're too black.
Yep. And that's not even to say that Jordan's not hella black, but like his appeal to white people is also, I think, tied because of capitalism, with how he became the most, with sneakers and selling all these shoes. And then it's always that comment he said where, well, Republicans buy sneakers too. But Jordan kind of did take that. He took that route instead of more of that Muhammad Ali route, I guess, where he embraced capitalism all the way, and always try to be safe when it comes to politics. Cause I remember a couple of years ago, he was getting crap for not speaking up about Black Lives Matter. And then eventually he did. It was because people were pressuring him or talking, shit about him. But yeah, that's what's really annoying with what these white people, these racists do is they'll just, I like this black guy because certain qualities are more of what I feel a black person should be like. They should be more of this white ideal, right? And they do the same thing with the rest of us that are not white. Like you're saying. So, these good examples you're pointing out with Bruce Lee or even with Latinos.
Yeah. I mean, that's what white supremacy is. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean you hate every other race. It means elevating whiteness to be supreme. So then you could even use BIPOC figures that you like, but you like them in a way that still elevates whiteness, right? Why I was thinking about Bruce Lee is because when I used to do a lot of like research and like looking into the rise of the alt-right, I would go to their message boards to kind of see what they were talking about. There were so many fucking threads about Bruce Lee, So, and or even like mixed martial arts, literal Nazi fight clubs, a lot of them like Bruce Lee too. So it's not about that you can't like these things. It's about what you're using them for. And they're always using Bruce Lee to elevate their whiteness, or they're talking about these features of him that are very white that other Asians or minorities should be able to learn from, that the system, is open for. This connects back to free market. It's open for anybody to succeed. And it just so happens that white people succeed in it the best because they're the most superior. Right. But if you're not succeeding, it's not the white people's fault. That's your own lacking, and then every once in a while, you'll have one of you who's an exception who can do that. So look at this guy, right? So instead of complaining to us, be more like him. Yeah,
they tokenize. So before we go, we're about to hit an hour, but let me ask you this real quick. It was actually had it in my earlier questions and I forgot about it. But your podcast also talks about pro wrestling, which I think is really cool. I used to be really into pro wrestling, not as much now, but I still have friends and cousins that are like follow it still to this day, and they're like older. And I really like that you guys talk about that too, because the thing I want to ask you about is, before we leave, is can you give me a Marxist analysis of pro wrestling?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much as far as like the way workers' images and time is owned by the company, and there's no way for them to own their image, to own their time. Right. And so the WWE in particular has always squashed that. There's also a lot of like Marxist writers who talked about the spectacle of pro wrestling and how it's an analogy of like existing superstructures. Right. So a lot of pop psychology, the way pro wrestling works, it's not inventing anything. It's just taking something that already exists and then using that to invoke an emotion in the fans. So let's use pro wrestling from a Marxist lens to explain racism then. And going back to what we were talking about with Bruce Lee and Michael Jordan and black athletes and how you can still be racist. So in pro wrestling, there's something called a heel, which is like the villain, right? So there's been ways that pro wrestling have gotten what they call putting over. So a white or a black wrestler was put over, meaning like made to be the face, the popular person, and the white wrestler be booed. And this happened, in the 50s, the 40s in the South, in some of the most racist territories. How were they able to do that? Because they portrayed the white wrestler as being more racist than these racist fans. So then in seeing that more racist wrestler, they thought they couldn't be racist, right? So in seeing somebody that was worse than them, they now had an excuse to be like, oh, I'm one of the good guys, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so pro wrestling was very much weaponizing that type of belief where if you find somebody worse than you, then that person worse than you is the example of whatever people are accusing of you, and you are the opposite of that. And so I think that is how a lot of like liberals and certain centrists and people operate, where they look at MAGA or they look at like, the alt-right. They point to things much worse than them and to use them to convince themselves they're one of the good guys, right? Or to use an example of like, oh, I dated an Asian woman, my wife is black, or I like Michael Jordan. But they know people who couldn't even do that, right? Who are so racist, they couldn't even date a black woman or like Michael Jordan. Then they're better than them, right? So the pro wrestling lens is actually very useful in analyzing the world, really, because it takes everything that exists and then deconstructs it to the very to the things that matter, just the bare bones of it. And then you can, then highlights it, accentuates it. So you can really see what's happening, how the mechanics of it really work, because pro wrestling takes these complicated, nuanced things that are happening in society, these superstructures, and then turns it into a spectacle. So you can really see what's at the heart of these types of institutional beliefs, these ways that white society, capitalist society is gaslighting us and making certain oppressive things default that we don't ever question.
I think that was a really good explanation. And it made me think about, it's the same thing as you talked about with UFC, right? And when I talked to Dr. Jennifer McLaren in an earlier episode, she talked about something very similar. It's the whole spectacle thing, right? Like UFC, it wasn't something, they also kind of like took that model from the WWE when it comes to the spectacle of it. She talks about that in her book, but they've done the same thing when it comes to like racism. Like I know they pitted like white MAGA UFC fighters to fight like, a black fighter. They know this will create some controversy, and pretty much in a way they're pretty much trying to be edgy, I guess, with that. But like they're using these actual issues that are happening in real life for their whole spectacle, because they know people are, like you're saying, there's going to be people in the audience that are really racist, but now they're seeing this UFC fighter who's even more racist. Kind of makes them feel better about themselves. Oh, I'm not racist. And I think that's like when you brought up liberals. That's kind of happened like with the Ukrainian-Russian war. There was those video clips of when they were saying, well, these refugees aren't like the ones from the Middle East. They're white. And like some of these commentators probably weren't even right-wingers. They're like on CNN, they're probably liberals, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought about that right now when you're talking about that. They pretty much make themselves feel better to think they're not racist by seeing someone else in this spectacle that's more racist or pretty much like the worst of what they really are. That makes sense, what I just said.
No, exactly. And I think looking at things like combat sports, pro wrestling, or even regular sports helps untangle these things, because I think for leftist, socialist, communists, Marxists, it's sometimes good. No, not sometimes. It is good to have other interests than just pure politics. And the reason why is because it's like standing too close to a wall, and now you can't even see, like, let's say it's like a painting and you're standing like 2 inches away from it on the wall. Now you can't even see what the whole painting is, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes you need something else, some other interest to pull yourself away from that, to look at that same thing with new eyes. Because the way we understand stuff is through comparison. So then you go to something else, you go to some other interest you have, that other interest. Naturally, then, if these are some of your interests, like your political interests, and your other interests, you'll start making comparisons. And in that comparison, you might be able to see politics in a new way. So it's very important to have other interests. And I think that's why sports, pro wrestling, combat sports, but not just that, like other stuff. Those are my interests, but other things can be used in the same way. I know there are socialists who use art in that way, use art to deconstruct politics and look at it in a new light. Literature, the same way, media, looking at a show like Squid Games to look at things in a new light.
I've even seen a podcast that does video games and like a materialist analysis. Can't remember the name of it right now, but I think it's on This Is Revolution Network.
Okay.
But I've seen stuff like that. But that's why I wanted, you did it. Why I did it. Why I created my podcast. Wanted to use something I like sports, but use that as use sports to talk about all these other things like Marxism and stuff, because you could apply it. You could apply it to anything. Mm-hmm. I get annoyed when it comes to folks that might be communists or leftists that really hate sports because they just think about the capitalism part of it when it comes to pro sports and that issue, instead of how we're looking at it, how we could use it as a tool. Because working class people are going to like sports. They're going to like all these different things. So if we want to get those people thinking more of a Marxist lens, why wouldn't we use those things they like, those interests?
Yeah. I mean, it's like if you don't want to have any interest in sport or you want to eliminate sports from your talk, or even like somebody made a great point. I can't remember who was talking about the same thing with religion. If you want to, just exclude any religious Marxists, out of your organization, when a high percentage of the working class are religious, are into sports, right? Then how are you going to ever reach across to them? Or what are you going to relate to? And I think that's why there's that stereotype about just theory, because they wouldn't mind the theory so much if you had other interests, other things you could talk about, or other ways to explain theory. But because you purely have this abstract pure ideas, then it becomes harder for them to engage with you, to relate to you.
Yeah, it is. And so that's pretty much why I started this podcast. Probably also, why you did, because we're using what we like. You use combat sports. I'm using more sports in general. There's all these other sports I want to cover. I tend to focus a lot on those that I watch a lot. Yeah. But I'm going to have a cricket episode eventually because one of my friends is really into cricket. But I don't know too much about cricket. But even sports like that I don't know about, I want to eventually have on my podcast and talk about them, because there might be someone that likes that sport. Mm-hmm. And we could talk about these issues, these topics like communism and stuff like that, and use that sport. Pretty much when I talk to my friend, whenever I do this cricket episode, we're going to talk about Beyond the Boundary and C.R.L. James. And so that book is really important when it comes to colonialism stuff and post-colonialism and decolonization. But it's also a book about a sport. So, I'm going to do that episode eventually, but that's, I guess, in a way why I did my more general one. But even, with your podcast, it started with combat sports, but now like you said, there's these other interests like Star Trek. So maybe some people listening to it don't even like Star Trek, but are listening to it because of your analysis, your commentary. But then there might be people that actually like Star Trek, and now now we're talking about Marxism and all this other stuff with Star Trek. So it's things like that I think sometimes communists that live here in the US or are from the West don't think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got to start from where they are. They already have interests that they like. So give them the interests they like and then add your take to it.
Exactly. So we went over an hour, but we could stop here. Thanks again, Sam, for coming on my podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on here. I've been wanting to talk to you on my podcast for a while. You could plug in right now, the Southpaw, and anything else before we go.
Yeah, sure. You can follow me on Twitter at LiberationistMA. You can find more about Southpaw at southpawpod.com. If this project sounds interesting to you, please support us on Patreon as well. And you can find the information for that at the website southpawpod.com.
Yeah, so there you go. I know some of my listeners also listen to Southpaw, but I know that some people don't. So check them out. Check out Sam's podcast and the other folks that work with them. And there's something for everyone in this podcast, pretty much. And then especially if you like combat sports. So thanks again, Sam, for coming on the podcast.
It was a pleasure.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And it's Friday, which means it's time for another edition of our weekly segment, The Red Spin Report, where we discuss sports, politics, and struggle with Miguel Garcia of the Anti-Conquista Collective, who's also the host and creator of the Sports as a Weapons podcast. Miguel, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Sean and Jackie, glad to be back.
Absolutely. And Miguel, Simone Biles, an Olympic gold medalist, along with 90 other claimants, it will be filing a $1 billion lawsuit in damages from the FBI for failing to stop Larry Nassar when they first received allegations of sexual abuse against him. And I mean, it's documented that, back in 2015, FBI agents knew about Nassar being accused of engaging in sexual assault with the young gymnast, but didn't do anything. And among the 90 claimants, along with Biles, it includes Michaela Maroney, Ali Raceman, who are both also Olympic gold medalists. And according to former University of Michigan gymnast Samantha Roy, she said, quote, "If the FBI had simply done its job, Nassar would have been stopped before he ever had the chance to abuse hundreds of girls, including me." I mean, you talk about criminal negligence. I'm not even sure what you could even call how derelict the FBI was in terms of handling this situation. But just wondering your top line thoughts about this, Miguel.
Yeah. So when this came out, I wasn't, surprised that they were filing a lawsuit because, like you said, we've kind of known for a while that the FBI failed to pretty much do anything for over a year once they heard of these allegations of Larry Nassar, sexually assaulting hundreds of gymnasts, women gymnasts, that he was the team doctor for the Team USA. And I know in the AP, one of the stories I read from the AP, I'm not surprised by this fact that I found out, but I guess, this isn't the first time we know of the FBI failing to stop something and also being sued. One of the articles I read, like comparing this, it's something different, but it was just another example of the FBI not doing anything. They were talking about when the mass shooting in Florida a few years ago, I think the Parkland High School, the FBI knew about that too, and that was like 5 weeks before it happened. So this is just another example of how incompetent, or even maybe they just don't care, the FBI knowing about certain things and not acting on it. And then something else that was interesting about this is, they're getting sued by 90 claimants, like you said, including Simone Biles and some of her Olympic gold medal teammates. And then but then it also includes just other U.S. college athletes that were in gymnastics. Like you said, the athlete from other schools like Michigan State or University of Michigan. But I also found it interesting, the FBI is not even the only one that got sued regarding this whole sexual assault case of Larry Nassar. There's been a settlement, I guess, with the University of Michigan, or Michigan State, I might say. That's where he was a doctor at. And then also, there was also a settlement with the Team USA Gymnastics and the Olympic Committee. So there's already been those settlements now, but now it's the FBI's turn. And it's interesting that the FBI, they pretty much admitted to not doing anything. When the FBI director was quoted as saying, Christopher Wray, he was quoting as saying last year when they prosecuted Larry Nassar a couple years ago, but I guess he made a statement at a conference, and the FBI director said, quote, "I'm especially sorry that there were people at the FBI who had their own chance to stop this monster back in 2015 and failed, and that's inexcusable," Ray told victims at there was a Senate hearing. So even the FBI there is admitting to their failure of stopping Larry Nassar.
Yeah, and even though, Miguel, the FBI admitted that they failed to stop Larry Nassar, the Justice Department just in May said it would actually not pursue criminal charges against those agents, who are now former agents, I guess, who were accused of actually giving inaccurate or incomplete responses during the Inspector General's investigation. So these former agents flat out lied during the investigation into Nassar and these sexual abuse allegations. It appears they were fired, but the Justice Department is not going to pursue criminal charges against the agents who lied in an investigation and kept this man from being brought to justice sooner. Who else do they sue? Who else can they sue, Miguel?
Exactly, Jackie. Who else can they sue? And then even this failure from the FBI is also just another example of just law enforcement. Whenever they do something, usually when I talk about law enforcement myself, I'm talking about when they're they're killing black and brown people and getting away with it. And it's usually kind of this, no one here was killed, but they were sexually assaulted. But like you said, they're not going to charge these FBI agents for lying and doing this on purpose, not actually investigating and doing all this shady stuff. It's just another example of just law enforcement in general in the United States, because this is what they do. Like, they cover up shootings whenever they kill black and brown people, and I guess, they also cover sexual assaults. But here it's the federal, police, it's the FBI. So it's just kind of just another example of law enforcement in general and how they really don't care about, they don't care about people, about victims.
Yeah, definitely. And, switching gears a little bit here, Miguel, I was looking at this piece recently published in ProPublica about how this professional soccer team owned by a billionaire is being constructed in Chicago, even amongst a serious housing issue there in the city. And I was hoping you could tell us more about that and, how this was able to carry through, how it was able to move forward.
So, yeah, this story just came out yesterday by ProPublica, but essentially the Chicago Housing Authority promised residents of these public housing complex called the ABLA in Chicago. So they promised them 20 years ago that they had return rights to return. So they pretty much, we're going to demolish their homes they were living at 20 years ago, which they did. And the plan was they were supposed to rebuild them, make newer ones, better housing. And then they promised the residents that they could return. But here we are 20 years later. They only built, according to this ProPublica article and this investigation, throughout those 20 years, they only built like 1/3 of the promised housing they were going to build. And now they decided, the city of Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot, the housing authority, had decided to sell, the biggest piece of land that's left. I believe it's 26 acres. And they're pretty much decided, instead of using it like they promised to build more housing for the people that used to live there, they're selling it to a billionaire, like you said, Sean, that owns the MLS Chicago Fire. And it's not for an actual stadium where they play their games, but it's a practice facility. So this is going to be a new practice facility. It's going to include 6 soccer fields, some business offices, stuff like that. So this is just another example of cities promising housing to residents, but then, instead giving it to some billionaires so they can make some money. And then the billionaires, or in this case, it's a sports team, saying, "Oh, we're going to build our facility here, but we're also going to pledge to fund some housing around this land for the community." But that's usually what sports teams say, and they don't usually do that. But when I found out about this story, it reminded me of what happened when the building of Dodger Stadium back in the 1950s. This is exactly what they did. back then, they promised they took the land through eminent domain back then for Dodger Stadium. They promised the Chicano Mexican residents that they could return and live in these new public housing, but instead they sold the land to the Dodgers and built Dodger Stadium, and they never got their housing. So this is, 60-some years later, and it's the same type of thing happening. I'm not surprised, but it's just another example of how capitalists don't care about people.
Yeah, particularly when we're talking about Chicago and the supposedly progressive Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who I guess people forgot that she used to be a cop, at least on the police board. She promised that she would improve housing, but she and the CHA are really going to end up raising most of the apartment buildings citywide, displacing thousands of families. Then they claim they're going to build or rehabilitate 25,000 units of housing within 10 years. There are already 30,000 people currently on the Chicago Housing Authority's waiting list for public housing. And it's just the housing commissioner said that the city needs 120,000 more affordable housing units right now. So, I mean, I of course I see the political move in this because it's beneficial for the developers and it makes money for Lori Lightfoot. But, what does this say about the hatred that sports teams and their owners have for working class and poor people in these cities that they are literally displacing and making homeless?
Yeah, this just shows that this is the ugly side of sports. And I have a podcast talking about sports and politics. The reason I call my podcast Sports as a Weapon is kind of like it's not only because it could be a positive and you could use sports as a weapon for yourself, but it's also the sports could be used as a weapon against you. And this is a perfect example of these billionaires pretty much using their weapon of sports, of being billionaires and owning a sports team, and using this weapon against actual poor Black and brown people, and not even caring. They're pretending, they do their PR. They say they're going to care about, it's supposed to be a mixed-use project. They're not just going to build this facility. They're going to build some housing. But we know the history of sports teams when it comes to getting tax-free stadiums and displacing people. We have a big history in this country of sports teams doing that. This is another example. And yeah, you're right, Jackie. It just shows that there's this hatred, this disregard that billionaires that own sports teams have for Black and brown people and poor people. And there was a quote I saw in the article from ProPublica of a resident, and he pretty much, I'm going to paraphrase it, but he pretty much said, this is just another example of how they do the Latino and Black people.
Yeah. And, also, Miguel, we're having this conversation coming after the January 6th committee hearings. And, Washington Commanders defensive coordinator Jack Del Rio described January 6th as simply a dust up at the Capitol. And I think he's faced some criticism of that, to say the very least. So what's going on here with Del Rio? And I mean, I'm also curious if you see this as maybe more broadly reflective of his politics in general.
So I've said it before when I've been on this show, but I'm a Raider fan. And so Jack Del Rio used to be the coach of the Oakland Raiders. And that was before John Gruden. And a few years ago when he was still the coach, it was 2017. This was right after Colin Kaepernick was, kneeling. It was still the beginning within that first year where he was kneeling and other players were deciding to kneel and join in solidarity. And the Raiders had played the Washington football team, now Commanders at the time. I think it was week two of the 2017 season. And all of the Black players all of the offensive linemen for the Raiders were Black that were starting in the game. They all decided to kneel or put their fists in the air, Black Power fist salute. But there was a controversy within the team, and it was because it came out that Jack Del Rio was very angry and against his players protesting. And it turns out that game, the Raiders were supposed to beat Washington, but Washington pretty much beat the Raiders handedly, and everyone was saying that the linemen weren't blocking for Derek Carr, the quarterback, as kind of like a revenge for Del Rio and maybe him and other white coaches and players not supporting them for their protests. So Jack Del Rio already has kind of this history, but since he's been the Washington Commanders' defensive coordinator, he's been tweeting a lot about politics, and this is just the latest example, but this one got a lot of attention, obviously. So he's had that history of his right-wing politics. He's said other things, but what he said in this tweet, he said, quote, this is his tweet that he did on June 6, 2022. He said, would love to understand the whole story about why the summer of riots, looting, burning, and the destruction of personal property is never discussed, but this is. So he's pretty much like angry at why there's an investigation on January 6th, but not when people were out in the streets protesting George Floyd getting murdered by police. So his tweet just shows pretty much his white supremacy that he believes in.
Definitely. Well, we thank you so much, Miguel, for joining us today. We're going to leave it there. We'll move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We'll be right back, so please stay with us.
By any means necessary.
That will wrap up the podcast. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Sports as a Weapon podcast.